Thank you, everyone. My name is Kian. I'm a documentation platform engineer at Cloudflare. We're going to be going over something that we call vendor Markdown, which is our way of making sure that kind of all of our content is consumable, obviously for humans who we write it for first and foremost, but also that all of our nice little interactive experiences, our tabs and everything like that, our code blocks, make sense in plain text Markdown for LLMs as well. And so we'll go over kind of the three kind of distinct types of users that we're kind of aiming to have our content work for. We have humans, everyone watching this. When you visit our documentation, what you see, you see our color scheme, our gray, our orange, our blue. You see all of our components, you see our tabs where you can click between them. Maybe it's instructions for the dashboard versus the API versus Terraform. We have external bots. Everyone will know things like Googlebot, Bing, where this is how we get onto Google, this is how we get into search engines. And so we need it to be accessible to them. We don't want to block them. We want them to be able to pick up the, kind of meaning of the content in the HTML so that if you search for Cloudflare docs, how do I do this? Google has a rough idea of, which pages contain that content and it can, rank it. So, and obviously internal bots is kind of our third sort of niche. This is sort of internal customer use cases where they want to consume our content. And so there's sort of three distinct groupings, I suppose. The Cloudflare dashboard, obviously, kind of our single pane of glass for if you need to configure anything, here's where you go. They want to pull in our Markdown and display it in line. Obviously, it's great if you have documentation. It's better if users don't have to, stop what they're doing, go find the documentation, dig it out, and then, keep swapping tabs. In this case, they pull in some of our Markdown content that we're offering and display it in line. And so obviously the benefit here is that they don't have to write their own. And it'll get, they'll drift away. There'll be a typo in both hours, but we only fix it in hours. And, it just stays in sync quite nicely if they can pull from hours as a source of truth. We have a business intelligence team, and for them, they have lots of projects around, big data workloads. And part of it is a content warehouse. And so what is all of Cloudflare's content? Our documentation, our API site, our learning center, ingesting all of that in a single place, with kind of a nice sort of structured format is super useful for all projects. And so we want to make sure that they can grab our content quickly, seamlessly. They don't have to do a lot of, custom business logic for us. It should just work. So we have customer support on a similar sort of angle where, we're looking into AI-powered chat solutions. So, if you're a customer, you want to make a ticket, we want to see if we can, based off what you're telling us and based on the information in our documentation, can we help you without you having to, create a ticket and kind of wait for a human to be able to assist you. And so here lies the problem. The developer documentation is a very big project. We have about 6,680 Markdown files, which result in 5,617 pages of content. So that's 5,600 plus, unique HTML pages with their own paths that are in our sitemap. Within these, we have about 124 Astro components. These are sometimes interactive, but typically not. And obviously we have the React components where we've done these because it needs to be filterable. It needs to be searchable. And so we have a lot of components and we also have a lot of usages of those. We have one component called render, which is for including reusable Markdown snippets. That one is used probably 2,000, 3,000 times in our documentation. And so therein lies one of our problems with the raw content that we're writing. So when we're writing MDX, obviously that turns into HTML. And you can see on the left here our tabs component. It's written with accessibility in mind by the Astro team. We use Starlight, which is a kind of off-the-shelf documentation theme by them. And, you have the role attributes, you have the ARIA attributes. It's accessible, screen readers can use it. And so it makes sense, not only to the human who might be pressing on a tab, but for the browser to understand it as well. The issue is that there is no plain text representation of an interactive experience. The whole point of plain text is that you can't really click on anything here. And so on the right, you can see This is what you would get if you took this Starlight Tabs custom element HTML and ran it through something like Turndown or Node HTML Markdown. There's lots of battle tested Markdown to HTML converters, but typically you do have to do some legwork when you're doing these custom elements and kind of custom CSS and JS. And so you can see here we get an unordered list with tab panel 6 and tab panel 7 as the link targets. These are usually intercepted by JavaScript. We prevent the default event and we show the tab. Not very useful here. There's not really any kind of linking between the two. If my one content wasn't literally one content, you'd have nothing linking it to that first option. And so obviously custom elements is the main part there. So you see Starlight tabs, you see Astra hyphen breadcrumbs, you see Starlight hyphen image hyphen zoom. These are all custom elements. And so they have no meaning to off-the-shelf kind of libraries. They know what a div is, they know what a H1 to H6 is. They don't know what these are. And so we have to write our own custom rules to kind of inform it. Hey, here's a structure of it, here's what it means. In some cases, we just removed them. Like, obviously, there's no plain text representation of an image. So Starlight Image Zoom is a cool little plugin by the Starlight maintainers. So any image you can click on and it'll zoom it to full screen and show you a caption. Not useful for Markdown, so we just removed that one. The other issue that you kind of can run into HTML, which we'll touch on a little bit later, is just that it's a lot of tokens. Kind of the opening and closing tags are great for programmatic parsing in like an XML library, for example. Not so great when you're trying to, save on costs with LLMs. The one below you can see here is an example of the MDX how we're writing. So you can see the render component and the package managers component. Render here is our kind of transclusion. It is our blocks of Markdown that we reuse in several places. What you see on the page will be nicely rendered, but obviously what you see in the Markdown, it's missing the content. If an LLM or if Googlebot saw render file equals prereqs, it means nothing. They don't have the context to know where that file is, where to look for it. And so what we've done is we're already in the unified JS ecosystem. If you don't know what it is, unified is a abstract syntax tree sort of library set for Markdown and HTML. And so you see here, obviously, we have an element that has a tag name property, a properties property, a children property. It just takes that HTML and Markdown that we're used to and turns it into just a nice structured sort of definition, effectively, that we can transform in JavaScript, and then we can restringify that into our Markdown. And so in our case, our pipeline effectively is that we write MDX, we have Astra render that into HTML. With the resulting HTML, we run that through our rehype plugin, and then we run that through a remark stringifier. And so effectively, we clean up the HTML and then take our cleaned HTML and turn that into Markdown. And so you can see in the top image here where we have Starlight tabs, a Markdown library doesn't know how to stringify an element called Starlight tabs because it means nothing. We turn it into a normal unordered list in this case. And so we have probably 4 or 5 in here that we handle specially. And there is also an allow list in here. So, we don't include scripts, we don't include images, stuff like that. And obviously, one of the biggest benefits of doing this in kind of, kind of AI world effectively is input tokens. Obviously, if you're not running it locally with something like Olama, you're paying for input and output tokens. And so with our Cloudflare Workers Get Started guide, it's not super long, but let's say there's, I don't know, probably 12 to 15 paragraphs in there. There's some code blocks in there. It is, kind of you're a new user. It takes you all the way towards the end of having a deployed application that you can visit. If you just took the HTML just out of the page and put that into, let's say, OpenAI's tokenizer, you would get about 15,200 tokens. That in itself isn't like an absolutely great number. But when you look at kind of vendor Markdown, which is our name for this kind of MDX to HTML to Markdown solution, it reduces it by 7 times. Obviously, this is for a given page. When you think about how, we have like 5,600 pages, that adds up quite quickly. If your goal is, hey, I want to feed pretty much all of the documentation that Cloudflare has into your, kind of LLM or RAG chatbot of choice and have it trained on it. When you're doing retrieval augmented generation, you have a trunk size. you can now fit more content in per chunk. And so it kind of works out great in pretty much everywhere. There's not really a downside to doing this. Obviously, it is optional. You do the way that we surface it, at least, is in the top right of every page. You will see a copy page as Markdown. So this is, let's say you're on our Get Started guide, but you're using something like a Cursor, Windsurf, Claude Code. You just want to paste it in. You can copy that page as Markdown, paste it into your AI tool of choice, and there it is. Obviously, if you page as Markdown, that will take you to the exact same URL with index.md added to the end of it. So every single page we have, all 5,600 of them, will have an index.md page at the end. And you can see here on the left, this is kind of an example of how we display it. And you'll see where you see the unordered list with the asterisk, and it says npm, pnpm, and yarn. That is actually, you see that package manager's component in the bottom image here, it is that. And so where we're kind of relying on these components to validate, okay, we support npm, pnpm, and these different, package managing the JS ecosystem. It's great for reducing our tech writers' burden. It's a lot more productive for them if they don't have to, remember all of these and keep copy pasting it. And so it helps our humans write for humans, and then we can turn it almost for free into a nicely machine digestible solution. A lot of the goal for us was that we don't want it to be more of a burden on our technical writers. It shouldn't be more difficult for a technical writer. It shouldn't be more difficult for us as an engineering team to support, these kind of machine readable ones. And so the way that we've done it here is that we only write the component once. We write it for a human. We make it look nice in the browser. We make sure it follows semantic HTML, make sure it's accessible. All of those, kind of key stars to aim for. And then this kind of vendor Markdown solution that we wrote with our plugin is free effectively for us. This isn't like something that adds time into our build process. It's not something that we have to fix quite regularly. We do have some tests in our CI to make sure that this works. Those haven't broken since we added them. We have checked that they work. It's always been suspicious that they haven't broken, but they do indeed still work. On the right, you can see this is our past 30 days of traffic for those paths. And whenever there are these sort of proposals, like everyone is like we've seen LLMs.txt, there's LLMs full.txt. There's also proposals which in theory sound great, but are they being adopted? Is ChatGPT actually going to train on these, or is it just going to fetch my page with Puppeteer and read it as if it was, a normal human? They are gaining quite a bit of adoption. In this case, on this graph, Claude is the second highest user agent that we see for these paths generically. And so we are seeing some increased adoption of this. Index.md, the kind of file extension that we've chosen, isn't necessarily a standard. And so we do have a link rel alternative in our HTML as a meta tag, just to say, if you would prefer a Markdown variation, go to here. And we're not alone. There are kind of other folks who are offering in MDX and want to create a Markdown version of it. Josh Larson, an engineer on the Shopify side who works on their documentation architecture, has done something pretty similar, where you can just add .text to the end of any of their URLs, and you will get, in effect, the vendor Markdown experience. One thing that they're doing, which I forgot to mention that we also do, is the making sure that links are absolute rather than relative. And so you'll see there, every link has https shopify.dev. We do the same with https developers.cloudflare.com just to make sure that the links, work. Because if it's a Markdown file, you don't really have the context of where you are. But as you can see in the image on the right, it's all open source. Everything that we do in Cloudflare Docs is open source on GitHub in Cloudflare/Cloudflare-Docs. All of our content, all of those Markdown pages that I mentioned, all of those components, how we render all this into Markdown, how our CI works with Astra, it's all completely open source. If you spot something on our docs that you'd like to do, go take a look at how we do it, go copy it, and add it into your own site. We have also started a how we docs section of our style guide, where it talks about kind of our AI consumability, a lot about what I've just spoken about here. And so, yeah, we've been open source since the beginning, but we're still making good headway on our sharing our patterns, sharing, here's why we do this. Obviously, you can see the code that we do it. We're also trying to share why we do it, what lessons we've learned from it, and kind of give back to the open source community who have given so much to us. We have folks who they see some things wrong in the docs. Maybe it's a typo, maybe it's a wrong command. They come and make a PR to us, and kind of our way of giving back is, we don't want to just take. We want to make sure we're benefiting open source as well. And that is everything from me on vendor Markdown.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kian. All right, folks, if you have any questions for Kian, drop them in the chat. Now, Kian, this is really cool, and we're doing something really similar at Netlify, and also built the docs on top of Starlight. And what I'm curious to learn more about is the process that you went through in terms of um, considering building or yeah, buying a tool or plugging a tool in that might give you the same effect versus building it on your own. You mentioned performance and fewer tokens. Is that kind of like, was that the main deciding factor, or were there other points of consideration?
I think for us, part of the technology choice of using rehype and remark is that obviously when you're using Astra, you're already in that kind of rehype and remark ecosystem. You just, open astra.config.ts. There's a Markdown, rehype plugins, and remark plugins array. And so we were already writing plugins to transform our HTML. And so the natural kind of progression of that was sticking with rehype um, to kind of create our filters here. In terms of why we didn't use, something like turn down or something like no HTML Markdown, which obviously off the shelf, don't understand some of our components, but it's not like rehype does either. We still have to write our own rules, and in this case, we still have to write these conditions here to say when you hit this unknown component, here's how you should transform it. You can do that in turn down with their rules API. But for us, since Astra is already all in on rehype and remark, we just kind of extended our usage there. We'd already written a few of our plugins in there. We'd already been pretty used to how kind of rehype and remark are structured. And so for us, it was just kind of the most productive for our team. But yeah, if you're already using turn down and stuff, you can port 99% of this to their rules API and it'll be pretty similar.
That makes sense. So there's a component to it that is definitely control based, that you've got your own custom components that you'll probably ship alongside Starlight's components, and how those translate into yeah, Markdown or the text that an LLM is going to consume. You felt like if you take this approach, you get a little bit more control over that.
Yeah, with our components, as like I say in the Astra file, for example, we only write the HTML for a human. We don't write like a second representation for LLMs. We
Mm.
don't export like a markdown version of it. We do try and write our components exclusively for, okay, run Astra dev, open the browser. How does it look? Does it look good? Awesome. And then, we do any fault work if we need to. Ideally, there's not much in this rehype plugin. Like, you see the quite in-depth handling of Starlight tabs. That's probably the biggest one, just because, it is that interactive experience, which doesn't exist um, in plain text in the first place because it's interactive, but also because it's a custom element. It's not HTML5 element. It's not a div. It's not a pre. It is, Starlight tabs, which is custom. And so that is probably one of 4 or 5 elements that we have to handle specifically. Everything else, assuming that we're sticking with, good semantic HTML, translates over pretty good by Remark. We Remark have a library called Remark Stringify, which is basically with this Remark AST, turn it into Markdown text. Obviously, it knows how to handle code, it knows how to handle a list. And so we get almost everything for free. And we have this little escape hatch for our custom elements.
Very cool. Okay. And you know what? I was just thinking, I think at this conference last year, it I had a similar question that I also wanted to ask you, which was, you know, I think a lot of these tools like Starlight that are just so easy to use out of the box and so quick to just stand up for really small sites that it can be it can be hard to see that they can scale to support enterprise level sites, sites with you have thousands of pages that you're managing. So can you share a little bit about just what you've learned or where you feel like Starlight has done particularly well or where you've had challenges as you've scaled up to thousands of pages?
Starlight has a really good system for it called overrides. And so obviously Starlight has its own components that come with everything. The header is a component, the footer is a component, the sidebar is a component. All of those, building blocks of a documentation site are components. And you can override them in a very nice way. It's built into it in Astro config. You just say, hey, for sidebar, render my sidebar component, which on the face value sounds like, okay, I have to write the entire sidebar myself now. You
Mhm.
don't have to do that. You can just import their default component and you can add a wrapper around it. You can add some CSS to it. You can do quite a lot. When we first moved to Starlight, when we did a migration in August last year, we did have one or two patches with patch package for some kind of edge case things. But part of the benefit of Starlight is not just the design of overrides, which make it super easy. The Starlight and the Astro team are just super nice to work with. And so all of our patches, we made an issue for it. They made a PR, they merged it. We removed them within the space of a month or two, to be honest. Obviously, they've made some good strides in that aspect too, where the model used to be, let's say, for the table of contents on the right, you would override the table of contents and you would modify the props. One of them is literally called table of contents in there. And so your override would literally only exist to modify props. You wouldn't actually be rendering any different HTML there. And that pattern worked, but it could feel a little clunky at times. Without any input from us, we were happy with it. They did something called root data middleware. And so you can just write a TypeScript Astro middleware and transform all of those yourself. And so you don't actually have to override many things anymore. If you do want to write your own HTML, sure, go for overrides. But for most use cases, like, okay, add a prefix into the title. So instead of it being overview, you want it to be Cloudflare docs slash overview. You can do that in root data. It's quite easy to do the sort of, hey, add this into the sidebar, hide this in the sidebar. You can say, hey, this page in the sidebar, it was last updated in the past week. So add a recently updated badge to it. All of those things where you want to, write your own sort of business logic effectively is just some TypeScript code in the middleware. And so obviously they do have a lot of plugins, but their escape hatches are very, very clean. There's no rough edges around them. It's not like a foot gun by any means. As soon as you need to reach for overrides or root data, it all has types, it's all documented, it all has examples. It's a very nice thing to use where when you're starting to patch things and you have to update your patch every version, it feels fragile. Overrides, obviously, Starlight's still in, pre 1.0. And so they do, have breaking changes here and there. But other than those changes where they've, redesigned something, we don't touch our overrides. We just update Starlight, give it a quick spot check that it still builds and the preview looks good. But we have total confidence in their team and their overrides to just keep working.
Yeah, I love that. And my team has had a very similar experience, like all positive for sure. All right, the last question I have for you is I think it's very cool that your entire documentation site is public. And I, know folks really like to put that content out there in an open source way, but there are challenges, particularly with docs and other product related code, where you might not want to give away content that is upcoming or features that are going to get released. So maybe can you talk just a little bit about some of the experience of and how you work with an open source repo in an effective way for Cloudflare?
Yeah. It obviously does have some considerations where a pattern that we've tried to adopt recently is generating documentation from other sources of truth. If you have an API for your product, like let's say Wex AI, they have an API that lists all of their models, what the schemas are. And so rather than having to handwrite, probably close to 50, 60 pages now of pretty verbose documentation about everything it supports. They give us an API, we save it as JSON, and we render it out. Obviously, that does come with the caveat that if we're an open source repo, the data you're giving us has to be okay that anybody can see it. We don't have password protected sections of our site. Everything is open source in GitHub. There isn't like we don't merge it with a private repo that we have. If you see something on developers.cloudflare.com, it's going to be in the Cloudflare docs repo somewhere. It may be loaded from an API where, we do have some components like GitHub code where we pull from other Cloudflare repositories if you want to, have your work as example in your project so you can test it. Sure, we can pull it in. You don't need to duplicate it. But yeah, obviously, currently it's quite a birthday week for us, one of our innovation weeks. And, we don't want docs to go live too early. We don't want to ruin the surprise. We want the blog and the docs to go out about roughly the same time. Luckily for us, since, we are an astrostatic site, we're a large one, but we are just an astrostatic site. Our CI tends to run to completion from merge to docs being live in about 12 to 15 minutes currently. And so for most launches, it's happy just enough that you can work from a fork, you can work from a local branch, and then just push it up at the last minute when you're happy for it. If it is a large piece of work, go for forks, go for private ones where, our technical writing team can still review the content. But generally, because our CI is so quick and also we do deploy with each merge, we don't buffer it up and say, okay, we'll do a weekly release of everything on Tuesday. As soon as you merge it, it'll be live within 15 minutes. It's just something that runs on every production commit. And so, yeah, it does come up obviously during these innovation weeks where we want to kind of keep the announcement aligned with the blog, aligned with a change log in dev docs. It tends to just be push it up and merge it around about when you want it to go live. But yeah, we're trying to go a lot for if it is something that you have to update quite regularly based on something else. Like let's say Wrangler, for example, is our CLI. Having to maintain the commands page was probably 1,500 lines of pretty verbose MDX. And it was just basically transplanting the documentation of Wrangler. So, you run npx Wrangler -help. You're basically just kind of translating that into MDX. Now, obviously, the Wrangler team have given us an API where we can just effectively import their command structure, all their namespaces, all their help text, and we generate that now. And so, obviously, that, if it pulls from an API, is updated, let's say 30 to 35 times a day, is probably how often we merge into the production branch on a day. So if it's from an API, there'll be a source of truth. No one can typo it. It gets updated several times a day. And so, that is probably what we push folks towards if they can, where, we don't want folks to have to come in weekly and say, okay, it's Tuesday, go copy this, go make a PR, ask someone to review it. If we can automate and get rid of that toil, great. If not, the merge and CI should be pretty quick.
Love that. Yes, that's wonderful. Well, Kian, thank you very much for the talk and for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you very much.